The air in the cabin of Blake's aging utility vehicle always smelled faintly of ozone and old paper. He preferred it that way, a constant, predictable scent against the unpredictable vastness he pursued. The sun, a pale, anemic orb, barely cleared the jagged eastern ridge as he approached the border checkpoint. Dust plumed from the tires, a fine, ochre cloud that settled on the parched scrubland, coating everything in a uniform film. He slowed the vehicle, the engine groaning in protest. The structure ahead was a skeletal affair of corrugated steel and chain-link fence, topped with loops of razor wire. A single, bored-looking guard stood beside a raised boom arm, his uniform of faded khaki. Blake had traversed this unofficial boundary hundreds of times, a necessary inconvenience separating the sparse settlements from the truly desolate stretches where his research facility lay hidden. The guard barely glanced at him, a perfunctory wave of a hand indicating permission to proceed. No questions, no identity checks. Blake was an accepted anomaly, a ghost in the machine of the region, only ever seen heading to or from the abandoned factory he'd converted into his private domain. He felt a familiar, dull ache behind his eyes, a phantom pressure that had been his constant companion for years, a testament to the sleepless nights and the unresolved echoes of a past he refused to acknowledge. He pushed it down, as he always did, focusing on the road ahead, the rutted track leading deeper into the isolation he craved. The factory loomed, a hulking silhouette against the pre-dawn sky, its broken windows like vacant eyes. Rust had painted intricate, weeping patterns down its concrete walls. Inside, the space was a labyrinth of repurposed machinery, custom-built antenna arrays, and server racks humming with a low, constant thrum. This was his sanctuary, his prison, and the crucible of his singular obsession. He moved through the cavernous main hall, past the silent, hulking forms of defunct presses, their gears locked in a permanent, metallic shrug. His footsteps echoed, crisp and solitary. Blake's workstation, a meticulously organized island amidst the industrial decay, glowed with the soft luminescence of multiple monitors. Coffee, thick and black, was his first order of business, a ritualistic fortification against the encroaching silence and the endless stream of data he sifted through. He settled into his chair, the worn leather creaking under his weight. His fingers danced across the keyboard, a practiced ballet of commands. He initiated the daily sweep, a comprehensive scan of the celestial sphere, searching for deviations, for whispers from the void that defied the predictable hum of the universe. For years, it had been a monotonous endeavor, a diligent cataloging of known phenomena, pulsars, quasars, cosmic background radiation, the familiar symphony of astrophysical constants. He knew their signatures, their rhythms, their subtle variations, intimately. Today, however, a new pattern flickered on the primary display. Blake leaned closer, a frown creasing his brow. It was a faint blip at first, a transient spike in the noise floor, easily dismissed as instrumentation error or atmospheric interference. But his custom algorithms, honed over 2 decades to filter out such terrestrial detritus, flagged it with an insistent crimson alert. He isolated the signal, rerouting it through a bank of specialized processors. The blip resolved into a sustained, broadband emission. Not a burst, not a pulse, but a continuous, structured wave. His breath hitched. The initial frequency analysis made no sense. It wasn't just outside the expected ranges, it defied the very principles of electromagnetic propagation. The energy profile was flat across an impossibly wide spectrum, like a perfect white noise, yet it carried an underlying, complex modulation that his systems struggled to parse. Blake cross-referenced the coordinates. The signal wasn't emanating from a single point source. It appeared to be arriving simultaneously from every direction, an isotropic flood that permeated the entire detection volume. He ran the spatial triangulation again and again. Each iteration returned the same impossible result: the signal was everywhere and nowhere, its origin indeterminate, its arrival instantaneous across vast, angular separations. He felt the familiar pressure behind his eyes intensify, a sudden, almost physical constriction. This wasn't an exotic pulsar or a newly discovered galaxy cluster. This was something fundamentally different, a violation of causality, a mockery of the light speed limit. The signal's informational density, as his preliminary analysis suggested, seemed to exceed the theoretical maximum for its apparent bandwidth, defying the very laws of entropy. It was a perfect, impossible stream of order from an unknown source. He spent hours running diagnostics, recalibrating the arrays, checking every cable, every circuit board. He even physically inspected the massive dish antennas mounted on the factory roof, their metallic surfaces glinting under the rising sun. Everything was nominal. The equipment functioned perfectly. The anomaly was real. Blake stared at the screen, the impossible wave shimmering like a mirage. His mind, usually a fortress of logic and empirical data, felt a sudden, profound tremor. He had always believed in the elegant, albeit complex, order of the cosmos, a grand mechanism governed by discernible laws. This signal was a discordant shriek in that symphony, a deliberate, impossible note that shredded the very fabric of his understanding. A peculiar sensation began to prickle at the edges of his perception, a subtle dissonance. The hum of the servers, usually a comforting backdrop, now seemed to throb with a faint, irregular beat, slightly out of sync with his own pulse. He dismissed it as fatigue, a byproduct of the shock and the relentless focus. But the feeling persisted, a quiet insistence that the impossible signal wasn't merely data on a screen, but something far more insidious, something that had already begun to seep into the quiet corners of his world. He leaned back, the worn leather chair groaning. The screen continued to glow, displaying the impossible waveform. His scientific mind, honed to dissect and explain, grappled with a phenomenon that simply could not be. A lifetime of dedicated research, of understanding the cosmos through its intricate rules, now seemed to crumble under the weight of this single, defiant anomaly. The initial spark of scientific wonder had curdled into a deep, pervasive unease, a premonition of something vast and indifferent stirring at the very edges of existence. He was determined to understand it, yet a part of him, a part he rarely acknowledged, screamed to simply turn it off, to walk away from the terrifying implications of a universe that could harbor such a profound, logical impossibility. But Blake had never walked away from a truth, no matter how unsettling. This, he knew, was only the beginning. The utility vehicle coughed once, then settled into a low rumble as Blake cut the engine. The air, thin and sharp with the scent of pine and distant diesel, offered little comfort. He adjusted the brim of his cap, a worn canvas affair that had seen more remote observatories than most. The border checkpoint ahead was a skeletal assembly of corrugated metal and faded warning signs, guarded by a single, stoic figure leaning against a post, arms crossed. Blake presented his identification to the guard, a man whose uniform hung loose, suggesting a recent weight loss or an ill-fitting issue. The guard's eyes, dark and flat, scanned the card, then Blake's face, then the card again. No questions were asked, no pleasantries exchanged. The silence stretched, thick with the hum of the distant power lines. Finally, a curt nod. The barrier, a rusted pole painted with diagonal stripes, swung open with a groan of ungreased hinges. Blake drove through, the crunch of gravel under his tires echoing in the stillness, and left the last vestiges of routine civilization behind. His facility, a converted underground bunker, lay nestled deep within the desolate scrublands, an hour's drive beyond the checkpoint. The entrance, a reinforced steel hatch disguised by overgrown native flora, hissed open as he keyed in the access code. Inside, the air was cool and still, smelling faintly of ozone and dust, a familiar comfort. He moved with practiced efficiency through the narrow corridors, past banks of humming servers and blinking indicator lights, to his primary analysis chamber. The signal awaited him. He had recorded it on a secure loop, a pristine, untainted stream of data, utterly alien. He activated the main console. The waveform, a jagged, intricate dance of peaks and troughs, filled the holographic display. It defied every known principle of electromagnetic radiation. There were no discernible patterns of modulation, no predictable frequencies, no recognizable mathematical progression. It was, in its purest form, a chaotic symphony that somehow maintained an impossible internal coherence. Blake worked for hours, then days, then weeks, fueled by stale coffee and an unyielding intellectual hunger. He ran every algorithm, every filter, every transform he possessed. The signal refused to yield. It was not encrypted, it was simply not designed for human interpretation. He tried to force it into a comprehensible framework, searching for prime numbers, harmonic sequences, fractal repetitions. Nothing. It was like trying to teach a fish to fly using only the laws of hydrodynamics. During this period, the world around him began to fray at the edges. His sleep, once deep and dreamless, became a fragmented landscape of unsettling impressions. He would wake with the distinct memory of a sound, a low, resonant thrum that vibrated deep within his chest, or a whisper just beyond the threshold of hearing, like dry leaves skittering across a vast, empty plain. He began to experience fleeting auditory hallucinations. A distant clatter in an empty corridor, a phantom creak from a ventilation shaft that hadn't been used in years. His focus, usually an unshakable fortress, fractured. He found himself staring blankly at the data, the alien waveform shimmering, and then, without warning, a prickling sensation would crawl up his spine. He would spin around, convinced he wasn't alone, that he was being observed. The bunker, designed for solitary work, suddenly felt too vast, too empty, too quiet. He started leaving lights on in unused rooms, a small, irrational attempt to push back against the growing sense of unseen presence. He scheduled a remote meeting with a colleague, a senior researcher specializing in signal processing, through a secure video link. "I've encountered something unprecedented," Blake stated, his voice tight with a mixture of excitement and profound unease. He displayed a segment of the signal. The colleague, a woman with sharp, intelligent eyes, leaned closer to her screen, a frown deepening on her brow. He watched the waveform for several long minutes, his usual analytical expression giving way to something akin to perplexity. "Blake, are you certain your equipment is calibrated correctly? This looks like pure noise. Or a catastrophic hardware failure." "It's not. I've cross-referenced with redundant systems, multiple sensor arrays. The data is clean." "Then perhaps it's an anomaly, a localized atmospheric distortion," she suggested, her tone dismissive, her gaze already drifting to something off-screen. "We've seen stranger things. Keep an eye on it, but don't dedicate too much bandwidth. We have actual projects with deliverables." The connection severed, leaving Blake staring at a blank screen. Later, he approached another colleague, a younger man known for his open-mindedness, in the facility's small, sterile common room. He showed him a compressed audio file of the raw signal, stripped of its visual representation. The younger man listened, his head cocked, a flicker of interest in his eyes. But as the strange, resonant hum filled the small space, his expression hardened. He shifted his weight, avoiding Blake's direct gaze. "Fascinating," he said, too quickly, clearing his throat. "Sounds like a very complex interference pattern. Maybe a new type of solar flare interaction? You know how tricky those can be to filter out." He then launched into a detailed, if somewhat forced, anecdote about a recent data corruption incident, effectively changing the subject and creating a subtle, almost imperceptible distance between them. Blake felt the isolation deepen. They didn't see it. Or perhaps, they couldn't. He returned to his analysis chamber, the hum of the servers a constant, low thrum against the rising tide of his own unsettling thoughts. Lack of sleep, the stress of the work, the sheer mental strain of grappling with something utterly unknown. These were logical explanations. The signal, still playing, shimmered on the display, a silent, incomprehensible testament to a reality far grander and more terrifying than he had ever conceived. Blake found himself at the border checkpoint, the hum of idling engines a low thrum against the oppressive heat that radiated off the cracked asphalt. He hadn't meant to come this far, but a specific component for his specialized equipment, a particular frequency modulator, was only available from a supplier in the desolate industrial zone just beyond this point. The concrete barriers, usually stark and utilitarian, seemed to ripple at their edges, their sharp lines softening, then hardening again in an optical illusion that felt too deliberate. The shadows beneath the guard towers stretched longer than they should, twisting into forms that his peripheral vision caught and then lost, like fleeting, dark specters. He hadn't slept properly in days, the signal an unwelcome, fascinating lullaby. A uniformed officer approached his vehicle, a clipboard held loosely in one hand. Blake noted the officer's uniform, the crisp lines of the fabric, the way it caught the harsh midday sun. For a moment, the pattern on the officer's sleeve seemed to shift, the threads weaving themselves into a complex, interlocking design that pulsed faintly, almost imperceptibly. Blake blinked, his vision clearing. The uniform was normal again, plain, unremarkable. He forced a smile, a dry, tight grimace, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. "Passport and declaration, please," the officer stated, voice flat, devoid of inflection, like a recording. Blake fumbled in the glove compartment. His fingers brushed against a crumpled receipt, then the smooth cover of his passport. As he handed it over, he noticed the officer's eyes. He knew it was exhaustion, the relentless pressure of the signal, the creeping paranoia. But the image lingered, a disturbing afterimage burned into his mind. The officer's gaze felt like it saw not him, but the unraveling cosmos reflected in his own terrified pupils. The officer returned his documents, his expression unreadable, dismissing him with a curt nod that felt less like a gesture of permission and more like an acknowledgement of some unspoken, terrible truth. She couldn't understand the intricate, impossible symphony that now played constantly at the edge of his awareness. The signal wasn't just data anymore, it was an atmosphere, a pervasive hum that colored every moment, every thought, every perception. He pulled into a desolate industrial district, the warehouse he'd arranged for his modulator pickup appearing as an indistinct block against the hazy sky. The air here was thick with the smell of dust and disuse, a metallic tang that seemed to catch in his throat. The corrugated iron walls of the surrounding buildings seemed to breathe, their surfaces subtly convex and concave, defying the rigidity of steel, shifting as if viewed through heat haze, yet the air was still. He found the designated loading bay, the contact waiting, a stocky individual with greasy overalls who merely pointed to a crate without speaking. Back in his makeshift lab, a converted storage unit on the outskirts of the city, Blake immersed himself in the data, the new modulator humming with quiet efficiency. The unit, windowless and insulated, offered a false sense of security, a temporary barrier against the encroaching strangeness. He had isolated specific frequency bands, hoping to find a mathematical key, a logical progression that would unlock its meaning. Instead, what appeared on his monitors defied every known principle of geometry and physics. He zoomed in on a particular waveform, an intricate lattice of energy fluctuations. It wasn't merely complex, it was impossible. Lines intersected at angles that should not exist in three-dimensional space, bending back on themselves to create paradoxical junctions. Shapes folded back upon themselves, creating volumes that were simultaneously inside and outside, existing in a state of continuous recursion. He tried to apply known algorithms, standard transform functions, but the data resisted, contorting, refusing to conform to Euclidean space. It was a visual representation of non-Euclidean geometry, not as an abstract concept, but as an inherent, undeniable property of the signal itself, as if the signal was the geometry. His fingers flew across the keyboard, rerunning simulations, cross-referencing with cosmological models, with quantum theories, with anything that might offer a rational explanation. Energies emerged from nowhere, matter disappeared into impossible dimensions, and temporal sequences looped back on themselves in ways that shattered linear progression. He saw patterns that mirrored his recent hallucinations, the shifting uniform, the bending walls, the ancient, indifferent light in the officer's eyes. They weren't random aberrations, they were echoes, reflections of the impossible truth embedded within the signal, now manifesting in his own perception. This wasn't an anomaly to be categorized, nor a new form of communication from an advanced civilization. This was a blueprint, a glimpse into an existence so utterly alien, so fundamentally different, that it made human understanding a pathetic, fragile construct. The signal wasn't from beyond the known universe, it was of a universe beyond human comprehension, a realm where the very rules of reality were rewritten, or perhaps, never written at all. And it was seeping into his own. The air in the lab grew heavy, thick with unseen presence, pressing in on him. He looked at the impossible geometries on his screen, then at his own hands, the lines of his palms seeming to subtly shift, to trace paths that led inward and outward simultaneously, like a Mobius strip of flesh. He pressed his face against the cool glass of the monitor, the impossible patterns reflecting in his wide, bloodshot eyes, distorting his own image. He was no longer deciphering a signal, he was being deciphered. And the entities that sent it were not merely indifferent, they were utterly, terrifyingly, other. The border checkpoint hummed, a low, guttural vibration that resonated in Blake's teeth. The air, thick with exhaust fumes and the distant scent of pine, felt heavy. He stood before the customs agent, a man with a perpetually furrowed brow, who scrutinized Blake's travel documents with an almost performative slowness. Blake's gaze, however, was already elsewhere, fixed on the distant warehouse where he knew the specialized component awaited. His mind, a relentless engine, processed only the schematics of the frequency modulator, its precise tolerances, and the critical role it played in his current work. Purpose of visit, the agent finally grunted, his voice flat. Acquisition of specialized scientific equipment, Blake replied, his tone devoid of inflection, his eyes still holding the image of the modulator's internal architecture. The agent stamped the papers, a perfunctory thud, and waved him through. Blake barely registered the exchange, already calculating the fastest route to the supplier's dock. Days bled into weeks, marked only by the escalating intensity of the signal. Blake barely slept, his small living space transformed into a labyrinth of wires, monitors, and half-eaten, forgotten meals. The frequency modulator, now integrated into his custom receiver, hummed with a new, unsettling resonance. It pulled the impossible transmission into sharper focus, not as a series of discrete data points, but as a vast, undulating presence. His colleagues, a handful of names he vaguely recalled, had stopped calling. He hadn't answered their last 3 attempts. The outside world had receded, a faint echo against the booming silence of his isolation. He lived on coffee and a frantic, almost desperate energy. His hands, once steady and precise, trembled slightly, yet his focus remained razor-sharp. The signal was no longer merely a pattern, it was a language of pure sensation. The symbols, once abstract glyphs on his display, began to coalesce into recurring motifs. They were not alphabetic, nor pictographic in any recognizable human sense. They were more akin to conceptual anchors, each one a compressed packet of profound, unsettling meaning. His search began in the digital archives of ancient linguistics and forgotten cosmologies, but quickly veered into the darker, more obscure corners of human knowledge. He spent hours in the hushed, dust-laden stacks of the university's restricted library, a place rarely visited by anyone outside of a handful of specialized researchers. Diagrams of impossible structures, intricate patterns that mirrored the signal's visual manifestations. Not images, but impressions of scale so vast they defied comprehension. He felt the crushing weight of colossal structures, not built of matter, but of pure concept. He sensed the indifferent gaze of an intelligence so ancient, so utterly alien, that the very notion of life as humans understood it was a triviality. One evening, as the signal reached a new peak, his receiver emitting a low, resonant thrum that vibrated through the floorboards, Blake felt a distinct, overwhelming presence fill the room. He saw nothing, heard nothing, yet he knew it was there. It was the fear of being utterly, completely alone in a cosmos that was not empty, but filled with things humanity was never meant to comprehend. He was no longer merely observing the signal, he was part of it, a tiny, fragile node in a network of unimaginable scale, and the realization threatened to shatter the last vestiges of his self. The hum from the console was no longer a sound, it was a pressure against Blake's skull, a dull ache that resonated in his teeth. The room, a space he had meticulously insulated against the world, felt like a void. Cold seeped into his bones, not from the climate control, but from an internal source, a chilling certainty that settled deep within his marrow. He had been hunched over the flickering displays for what felt like days, the raw data streaming, twisting, reforming into patterns that defied conventional logic. He traced a line of impossible geometry on a holographic projection, the shapes shifting even as he watched, like smoke attempting to hold a solid form. This was not a language of symbols, but of conceptual erosion. It was the universe speaking, but not to him. It was merely being, and Blake was merely intercepting its indifferent, vast existence. He felt a tremor begin in his fingertips, then spread through his arms, a vibration that wasn't physical, but perceptual. The air in the room thickened, tasted of ozone and something metallic, yet there was no source. The signal intensified. It wasn't louder, but closer, as if the space between his console and his mind had collapsed. The holographic projection surged, bleeding from the screen, no longer contained by the glass. It expanded, encompassing the entire room, then the walls, then the ceiling. Blake felt the rigid lines of his research station soften, then buckle. The familiar corners of his vision wavered, blurring the distinction between solid matter and translucent energy. Then, the world broke. It was not a vision in the traditional sense, no image, no form. It was a comprehension. Reality peeled back like a desiccated skin, revealing the true, underlying structure. Blake perceived not a creature, but a geometry of incomprehensible scale, a colossal, indifferent arrangement of fundamental truths that made a mockery of space and time. It was not in the universe, it was the universe, or perhaps, what the universe truly was, beyond the comforting lie of 3 dimensions and linear progression. He saw the vast, churning indifference of it all. Not a mind, but an existence so immense, so ancient, that planets were dust motes caught in its slow, imperceptible currents. Stars were pinpricks of light on its surface, and galaxies merely eddies in its wake. He felt the crushing weight of its presence, a silent, absolute negation of all meaning. The air left his lungs, not from lack of oxygen, but from the sheer, overwhelming truth of it. His perception of up and down, left and right, inside and outside, dissolved. He was adrift in a sea of pure, unadulterated existence, an infinite, non-Euclidean expanse where familiar physics were childish fables. Blake gasped, the sound ragged and thin in the suddenly silent room. The impossible geometry receded, the walls of his station snapping back into place with a violent, jarring lurch that rattled his teeth. The console hummed, ordinary once more. He stumbled back from the console, his legs weak, his mind reeling. The air tasted clean, yet he could still sense the phantom ozone. His fingers, still trembling, felt the solid, familiar plastic of the keyboard, but the memory of passing through it lingered, a terrifying, tactile hallucination. He had to move. He had to escape the confines of this room, this knowledge. A desperate, irrational urge seized him, a need to find a place where reality was undeniably solid, where the rules of existence were enforced. He felt compelled to cross a threshold, to prove to himself that boundaries still existed. Hours later, the sun a pale smear in the overcast sky, Blake found himself at a border checkpoint, the exhaust fumes from idling vehicles thick in the air. The concrete barriers, the chain-link fences topped with razor wire, the stern, impassive faces of the security personnel, it was all aggressively, reassuringly mundane. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, watching as a vehicle ahead of him was scrutinized. A security officer approached his window, a clipboard in hand, uniform crisp. "Purpose of travel?" the officer asked, his voice flat, professional. Blake looked at him, truly looked. For a fleeting instant, the officer's face seemed to ripple, the contours of his jawline stretching, pulling, as if his very bone structure were a temporary arrangement. The uniform's fabric appeared to shift, revealing glimpses of the impossible geometry beneath, the same patterns that had unfolded in his research station. Blake blinked hard, his eyes burning. The officer was solid again, his expression unchanged. "2. Cross," Blake managed, his voice hoarse. He cleared his throat, trying to force coherence. "Just crossing." The officer's gaze was steady, piercing. "Any goods to declare?" Blake shook his head slowly. He had no goods. He looked past the officer, at the guard tower, at the distant, hazy line of the horizon, and knew that no border, no wall, no human construct could ever contain the truth he had glimpsed. The universe was broken, and he was staring through the cracks. Blake stood before the inspection booth at the border checkpoint, the hum of the idling engines and the distant, metallic clang of freight containers, an unbearable symphony of the mundane. He clutched a worn leather satchel, its contents a chaotic jumble of printouts, crude schematics, and a small, modified receiver unit. The chill he'd felt before, the profound indifference, had sharpened into an icy blade, carving at the edges of his vision. He could still taste the faint, metallic tang of the air, a flavor that had become synonymous with the signal's subtle intrusion. A customs officer, a woman with tired eyes and a rigid posture, motioned him forward. "Passport and declaration, please," she stated, her voice flat, practiced. Blake fumbled for his passport, his fingers feeling alien, thick. The laminated photo stared back at him, a younger man, less haunted, less aware. He pushed it across the counter. As the officer scanned the document, the fluorescent lights above flickered, or perhaps it was just his perception. The sterile white walls of the booth seemed to breathe, contracting and expanding in imperceptible increments. He focused on the officer's face, trying to anchor himself. Her features, initially ordinary, began to subtly shift. The lines around her mouth deepened, then blurred. It was the signal, whispering through the very air. "Exposure," Blake managed, his voice hoarse, thin. "I need to expose it." The officer paused, his gaze sharpening, though his eyes still held that impossible depth. "Expose what, sir?" Blake leaned closer, his knuckles white against the counter. "The signal. From beyond. It's not a message. It's a presence. It's dissolving everything. Reality. Our minds. It's showing us. The frequency shifts. The patterns. They're not random. They're structures of indifference." He shoved a stack of papers towards her, the receiver unit clattering onto the counter. The officer's expression hardened. She pushed the papers back, her hand firm. "Sir, I need you to step back. What is this equipment?" Another officer, a man with a heavy build and an alert gaze, approached the booth. Blake could feel their scrutiny, a physical weight. "It's how I heard it," Blake insisted, his voice rising, a tremor running through him. "How it showed me. The cosmos isn't empty. It's full. Full of structures. Ancient, vast. And we are nothing. Less than dust. They don't even see us. The words spilled out, a torrent of desperate revelation. This isn't just a signal. It's the sound of the universe unmaking itself, showing its true face. And it's already inside. The heavy-set officer reached for the receiver unit. "Sir, you need to calm down. This is a restricted area." It wasn't physical. The rigid walls of the checkpoint buckled. Their voices became a chorus of the signal, the resonant hum amplified, tearing at the fabric of his hearing. He saw it then, truly saw it. Not an entity, not a being, but an order. An ancient, indifferent framework upon which all existence was merely a fleeting, accidental ripple. Humanity, its dreams, its struggles, its very concept of reality, was a minuscule, inconsequential anomaly. The signal wasn't trying to communicate. It was simply being. And in its being, it erased. A scream tore from his throat, not of fear, but of absolute, annihilating comprehension. The counter before him dissolved into a swirling vortex of impossible colors. The air thickened, becoming a viscous, invisible medium that pressed in on him, suffocating him with the weight of universal truth. He was no longer Blake. He was a conduit, a vessel for the unfiltered, horrifying indifference of the cosmos. He felt himself stretching, becoming thin, translucent, his thoughts scattering like dust motes in an infinite gale. The border checkpoint, the officers, his satchel, his very identity, all were consumed by the overwhelming, silent roar of everything and nothing. He was unmade. He was free. He was gone. The rigid walls of the border checkpoint did not buckle. Not truly. Blake knew this with a clarity that was both searing and utterly meaningless. What buckled was the idea of them, the thin, brittle shell of human perception that held the universe in a convenient, comprehensible form. The fluorescent lights above flickered, not in their physical filaments, but in the way Blake's optic nerves now interpreted their output. They pulsed, not with electricity, but with a silent, resonant hum that spoke of unfathomable distances and the slow, grinding indifference of eternity. The officer, his hand still extended towards the receiver, froze. His face, once a collection of familiar human features, a nose, eyes, a mouth, now shimmered, a transient arrangement of atoms temporarily coalescing into a pattern Blake had once called man. Beneath the skin, Blake saw the intricate, pointless dance of cellular machinery. Deeper still, the faint, shimmering outlines of structures that were not biological, not physical. Present. Tendrils of something vast and cold, like shadow weeds, seemed to thread through the officer's very being, anchoring him to a cosmic substratum Blake now intimately understood. A sound escaped Blake's throat, a low, guttural exhalation that was less a word and more a confession of absolute, terrifying comprehension. He staggered back, not from any physical force, but from the sheer weight of this new vision. The metal desk, the worn linoleum floor, the faded posters listing travel regulations, they were all transparent now, thin veneers over an abyss of non-existence. He saw the energy, the raw, unthinking force that bound subatomic particles, and he saw the spaces between them, vast and echoing, filled with the presence of something ancient, something that had always been there, watching. "Sir?" They were just sounds. Blake tried to speak, to explain the colossal, beautiful horror that had unfolded within his mind, but his tongue felt alien, a fleshy instrument incapable of articulating the truth. How could he describe the sensation of being everywhere and nowhere, of seeing the universe as a thought in a mind too vast to contain, of realizing that humanity was but a fleeting pattern of static on a cosmic radio frequency? He stumbled against a filing cabinet, its solid form offering no resistance to his new perception. His hand passed through it, not literally, but in the profound, unsettling sense that its solidity was an illusion, a collective agreement of human consciousness. It was a tapestry, and the officer, the checkpoint, Blake himself, they were all just loose threads, momentarily visible, soon to unravel. The officer moved, a blur of motion that Blake's eyes now perceived as a sequence of discrete, jerky frames.
"I'm calling for assistance." "Assistance."
The word reverberated, absurd and pathetic.
What assistance could there be against the truth?
He was no longer afraid. Fear was a human construct, a survival mechanism for creatures clinging to a fragile illusion. He was beyond fear.
He was simply witnessing.
He looked at the officer again, truly looked. The tendrils he'd seen before were more pronounced now, like faint, luminous veins beneath the officer's skin, pulsing with a slow, alien rhythm. They weren't just in the officer. Blake could see them in the faint outline of the camera mounted on the wall, in the stagnant air, even in the faint dust motes dancing in a beam of sunlight that pierced the grimy window. The entity's influence wasn't just in his mind, it was subtly, irrevocably, bleeding into the world. It was a quiet, insidious infection, rewriting the very grammar of existence. He took a step back, reaching for the radio on his belt. "Sir, Blake, I'm going to have to ask you to cooperate."
"Just calm down."
Blake didn't hear the words. He heard the faint, high-pitched whine emanating from the radio, a frequency that resonated with the tendrils he now saw. It wasn't just a communication device, it was a conduit, a tiny, insignificant node in the vast, spreading network. The signal wasn't just decoded, it was integrating. He extended a hand, not to touch, but to trace the air, as if feeling the contours of this new, terrifying reality.
The officer flinched, interpreting the gesture as aggression.
He pulled the radio from his belt, his thumb hovering over the transmit button.
He knew the officer didn't. Not yet, but soon.
The tendrils were growing, thickening, making their silent claim.
The truth. It's not something you find. It's something that finds you.
A new officer, alerted by the commotion, appeared at the door, his face a fresh canvas for the shimmering lines Blake now perceived. The new arrival paused, assessing the scene, a disheveled man, speaking in riddles, and a colleague backing away cautiously. Blake saw the tendrils in the newcomer too, slightly less defined, but undeniably present. The entity wasn't just warping his mind, it was slowly, patiently, making its presence known to the collective consciousness, one fragile human at a time. The horror was no longer confined to the echoes of his own thoughts. This was it. This was the aftermath of sanity. Not a sudden break, but a slow, irreversible unfolding. He was no longer Blake, the astrophysicist. He was a vessel, a receiver, irrevocably tuned to a frequency that revealed the universe as a vast, indifferent mechanism, and humanity as a fleeting, inconsequential dream. The walls of the border checkpoint, the officers, the entire world, were merely temporary constructs, waiting for the true architecture to assert itself. He was free, in a way, from the illusions of human existence, but it was a freedom born of absolute, terrifying clarity. The cosmic entity had not just touched him, it had become him. And it was reaching further. The border checkpoint hummed with an unsettling energy, a low thrum that Blake now understood was merely the surface noise. The new officer, a younger man whose uniform still held crisp creases, stood in the doorway, his gaze sweeping over the scene. Blake watched the shimmering lines, the intricate, barely visible tendrils, begin to manifest across the officer's face, tracing the contours of his jawline, outlining his eyes with a faint, ephemeral glow. They were not just on Blake, or on the colleague, they were on everyone. He glanced at the colleague, who had retreated further, a hand now resting near the sidearm at his hip. The colleague's eyes darted between Blake and the newcomer, a silent plea for intervention passing between them. Blake felt a strange calm settle over him. There was no longer fear, only a profound, terrible understanding. He had been blind, utterly blind, and now the veil was torn. He took a step forward, his hands open, palms facing the officers. "It's not all right," Blake stated, his voice steady, devoid of the frantic edge it had carried moments before.
None of it is alright. You just can't see it yet.
He gestured vaguely at the air, at the faint distortions only he could perceive.
The signal. It's not from outside. It's of here. It always has been.
The new officer exchanged a quick, worried glance with the colleague. Sir, you need to calm down.
Let's just take a breath.
He began to advance slowly, his hand moving towards his own sidearm, a gesture Blake noted with detached interest. The tendrils on the officer's arm seemed to pulse with a faint, internal light, mirroring the tension in his muscles.
Calm down?
Blake's lips curved into a thin, mirthless smile.
How can I calm down when the truth is screaming? When the very fabric of existence is revealed as a tapestry woven by indifference?
He extended a finger, pointing at a barely perceptible shimmer just beyond the new officer's ear.
It's there. On you. In you. It's the language of everything. And we are merely echoes within its vast, silent pronouncements. That's enough, the new officer said, his voice hardening.
He drew his sidearm, holding it loosely at his side, not aimed, but clearly displayed. The metallic glint caught the overhead lights, and for a moment, Blake saw the tendrils coalesce around the weapon, making it seem less like an object of authority and more like a conduit for the unseen currents. The colleague, emboldened by the firearm, stepped forward, attempting to flank Blake. He's not making any sense, just get him out of here. Blake ignored them, his gaze fixed on the patterns that now danced with increasing intensity across the checkpoint's sterile walls, the tiled floor, the very air itself. They weren't just lines, they were forming glyphs, symbols of impossible complexity that shifted and reformed with dizzying speed.
He could almost hear them, a symphony of silent, cosmic pronouncements.
The signal was no longer an external bombardment, it was an internal resonance, a
complete retuning of his sensory apparatus. You think you're containing me?
Blake chuckled, a dry, raspy sound.
You think a cell, a lock, a barrier will stop this? It is everywhere.
It is the space between the atoms, the silence between your thoughts.
We are not significant. We never were.
We are merely accidental patterns, fleeting noise in a universe that sings a song of ancient, indifferent architects.
As he spoke, the new officer lunged, attempting to seize Blake's arm.
Blake sidestepped with an almost unnatural fluidity, his eyes wide with a new, terrifying clarity. He saw the officer's movements not as an attack, but as a predictable sequence of energy flows, a dance choreographed by the tendrils themselves. He saw the intent, the anger, the fear, all as visible filaments. You are merely acting out the signal, Blake whispered, almost to himself, as the new officer stumbled past him. The colleague then moved, tackling Blake from behind.
The impact sent Blake sprawling onto the hard floor of the border checkpoint.
The pain registered, a sharp jolt, but it was distant, secondary to the overwhelming visual and auditory symphony now engulfing him. He was on his back, staring up at the fluorescent lights, which now pulsed with the same intricate, shimmering patterns. The tendrils wove through the light fixtures, along the ceiling, down the walls, enveloping the officers who now knelt over him, restraining his arms. It's not ending, Blake murmured, a strange euphoria mixing with the horror.
It's beginning. For me, it's beginning.
His vision sharpened, focusing on the officers' faces. He saw them not as individuals, but as nodes within a vast, indifferent system. He was not being subdued by men, he was being integrated by the signal.
The officers lifted him, half dragging him towards a detention area within the border checkpoint.
Each step was a jolt, each sway of his body an echo of the cosmic rhythm. He looked out at the fleeting glimpses of the checkpoint's exterior, the distant, hazy landscape, and saw the tendrils stretching infinitely, weaving through the atmosphere, connecting the earth to the sky, and beyond. The signal was not a discovery, It was a revelation of what had always been. Blake was not mad, he was merely awake. And in that awakening, he understood the true horror: humanity was not insignificant because of its size or its fleeting existence. It was insignificant because it was merely a temporary configuration within a consciousness so vast, so ancient, so utterly indifferent, that its very existence was the cosmos itself. He was not a vessel, he was a monument. A living, breathing testament to the quiet, terrifying truth that had always been humming beneath the surface of reality, now amplified, permanently visible, and undeniably real. He was not alone in its presence, he was merely the first to truly perceive it.